In Harvest County, Montana, Russ tells more truth than words ever could. A weathered hand traces the edge of a broken gear, feeling for answers in cold metal. Outside the workshop window, corporate SUVs cruise past foreclosed farms like vultures circling dying prey. The morning sun glints off their tinted windows, the same sun that once promised prosperity to generations who worked this soil. They say you can't fight progress. They say the age of the craftsman is over, but they never counted on a man with nothing left to lose. When the powerful take what isn't theirs, they expect submission. When they bury their sins beneath floodwaters and corporate documents, they expect silence. When they murder a man and call it suicide, they expect his memory to die with him. What they don't expect is the brother who knows the difference between a right-handed signature and a left-handed truth. Who understands that some machines and some men aren't meant to be replaced? In the heartland, the most dangerous sound isn't a gun being loaded. It's a toolbox being opened for the last time. Montana's autumn painted the Clearwater Valley in amber and gold. But Frank Calloway had no time for scenery. His weathered hands were deep in the guts of a John Deere combine that had chosen the worst possible moment to die. 50 yards away, smoke billowed from the wheat field where the Matthews family was frantically trying to salvage what remained of their harvest. Mr. Calloway. 12-year-old Tommy Matthews came running, panic etched across his freckled face. Dad says it's getting worse. Frank looked up from the engine, squinting against the afternoon sun. He could see Robert Matthews and his wife Sarah battling with fire extinguishers against spreading flames that had erupted when their ancient combine had overheated and sparked. "Son of a bitch," Frank muttered, grabbing his toolbox. At 62, he didn't move as fast as he once did, but decades as an Army engineer had taught him to recognize a losing battle. "Tommy, run back and tell your folks to get clear. That machine's about to go." "But the harvest won't matter if your parents are dead," Frank snapped. "Go!" As the boy sprinted away, Frank surveyed the situation. The drought had turned the remaining wheat into kindling, and the wind was picking up. The combine's fuel tank was nearly full, standard procedure during harvest, when every minute counted. If the fire reached it, Frank grabbed the radio from his belt. "Marge, you copy," the staticky voice of Marge Wilson, who'd been dispatching for Callaway repairs since Reagan was president, crackled back. "I'm here, Frank. Call the fire department. Matthews North Field. Combined fire spreading to the wheat." He paused. "And call Parker. Tell him to bring the bulldozer. We need a fire break. Quick." Frank ran toward the burning combine, ignoring the protest from his bad knee, a souvenir from Afghanistan. Robert Matthews was still desperately trying to extinguish the flames while Sarah screamed at him to get back. "Robert, get the hell away from there," Frank shouted. "My harvest. Frank, everything we have is riding on this." Frank reached him, grabbing his arm. "And your family, what are they riding on?" The words cut through Matthew's panic. He looked back at Sarah and Tommy, huddled at what they thought was a safe distance. "That fuel tank has about 3 minutes before it blows," Frank said quietly. "And your family's not nearly far enough away." Robert's face crumpled. 3 generations of Matthews had worked this land, and now he'd be the one who lost it all. "Get them back to the house," Frank ordered. "I'll see what I can do." As Matthews reluctantly retreated, Frank circled the combine, assessing. The fire had started in the engine compartment but was spreading fast. The fuel lines hadn't ignited yet, but it was only a matter of time. Frank threw open his toolbox and pulled out bolt cutters and a wrench. If he could separate the fuel tank before the fire reached it, he might save the Matthews home a quarter-mile downwind. It wouldn't save the harvest, but it would keep this bad day from becoming tragic. Working with the precision that had once disarmed IEDs in war zones, Frank cut through mounting brackets and disconnected fuel lines, twisting the ladder upward to prevent spills. Sweat poured down his face as the heat intensified. His lungs burned with each breath. A sharp crack above made him look up, just as a burning piece of the combine's cabin broke free. Frank dove, feeling the heat sear his back as he rolled away. The flaming debris crashed where he'd been standing seconds before. Stubborn old fool, he muttered to himself, scrambling back to his feet. The fuel tank was almost free. Two more bolts and the distant sound of a bulldozer announced Parker's arrival. Frank glanced over his shoulder to see the yellow machine creating a wide dirt barrier between the burning field and the Matthews home. Small mercies. With a final twist of his wrench, the fuel tank came free. Frank dragged it away from the combine, ignoring the screaming pain in his back and knee. 30 yards, 40, 50. As far as his strength would allow, he'd barely cleared what he judged to be the minimum safe distance when the combine's hydraulic lines ruptured. The resulting fireball sent a shock wave that knocked Frank off his feet. He hit the ground hard, the taste of dirt and blood filling his mouth as he watched the Matthews' livelihood go up in flames. Parker found him there minutes later, sitting in the dirt, staring at the inferno with the detached calm of a man who'd seen worse. "Jesus, Frank," Parker said, extending a hand to help him up. "You trying to join David early?" The mention of his brother sent a familiar pang through Frank's chest. 3 months since David's funeral, and the wound was still raw. "Someone's got to keep you employed," Frank grunted, accepting the help. His body protested as he stood. Matthews and his family, safe at the house, fire departments on their way, but Parker gestured at the burning field. Yeah, there was nothing left to save. Frank's workshop sat on the outskirts of Riverdale, the largest town in Harvest County, though large was relative in this part of Montana. The sign reading Callaway Repairs had faded years ago, but Frank had never seen the point in repainting it. Everyone in 3 counties knew where to find him when their equipment broke down. The morning after the Matthews fire, Frank was sorting through invoices at his cluttered desk, a cooling cup of black coffee forgotten beside him. Half the papers were marked with notes like, "Pay when harvest comes in," or "Split into 3 payments." Frank had never been good at the business side of things. That had been David's department. A knock at the open door made him look up. Sheriff Leona Blackburn stood in the doorway, her weathered face grim beneath her department issue hat. "If you're here about yesterday's fire, I already gave my statement to Deputy Carson," Frank said, returning to his invoices. "I'm not here about the fire." "Frank." Leona stepped inside and removing her hat. "Mind if I sit?" Something in her tone made Frank pause. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, suddenly aware of how his back ached from yesterday's exertion. "How bad?" he asked simply. "Notice from Harvest Financial." She placed an official-looking envelope on his desk. "They're calling in your loan." Frank stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. "They can't. I've got an arrangement with David's." He stopped himself. David was gone, and with him, apparently on whatever arrangement he'd made with the bank. "They're saying the last 3 payments were missed," Leona continued, "with the flooding damage to your warehouse last spring. And now—" "How long?" 30 days to pay in full or they take possession." She hesitated. "Frank, this isn't just happening to you. Jensen's Hardware got the same notice yesterday. Wilson's place too. Something's happening with that bank." Frank finally picked up the envelope, feeling its weight like a death sentence. After Vietnam, David had used his service pay to open this shop while Frank did another tour, then another. By the time Frank finally came home for good, Callaway Repairs was the lifeblood of local farmers. When David's gambling problem surfaced, Frank had covered for him, worked double shifts, kept the business afloat, but he couldn't outrun a bank. "Thanks for bringing this yourself," Frank said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "You saved the Matthews family yesterday," Leona replied, standing. "Way I see it, Harvest County owes you more than just gratitude." After she left, Frank finally opened the envelope. The numbers swam before his eyes, $157, $832.45 due in 30 days. Impossible. Even if every farmer who owed him paid in full tomorrow, he'd barely make a dent. Frank's gaze drifted to the photograph on his wall, 2 young men in army uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grins wide beneath the Afghan sun, before David's gambling, before the drinking, before the accident that nobody in town quite believed was suicide. "What the hell did you get us into?" "Dave," Frank whispered. The photo offered no answers. The next day brought no relief from Frank's financial worries, but it did bring a distraction in the form of an unfamiliar pickup truck pulling into his lot. The vehicle was practical but well-maintained. Unlike the battered farm trucks he usually serviced, the woman who stepped out was somewhere in her 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of tan that came from actual outdoor work. Not salon beds. Frank watched through the window as she circled to the truck's bed, which held what appeared to be a partially dismantled John Deere tractor from the early 80s. Not the oldest machine Frank had worked on, but certainly a classic. The bell above the door jangled as she entered. Up close, Frank noticed intelligent eyes that assessed the workshop with subtle precision. "Help you?" he asked, wiping his hands on a rag that might have been clean once, during the Clinton administration. "Rachel Morgan," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, calloused. "I've got a 1982 John Deere 4440 with a hydraulic system that's fighting me. Heard you're the man to see." "Depends who you heard it from," Frank replied, but he followed her outside to examine the tractor. Rachel pulled back the tarp covering the machine's exposed components. Started as a simple fluid change, ended up finding metal shavings in the reservoir. "I've narrowed it down to either the main pump or the control valve assembly, but I can't get proper pressure readings to confirm." Frank raised an eyebrow, impressed despite himself. Most people who brought him equipment could barely identify which end of the tractor was which, let alone diagnose hydraulic issues. "You've worked on these before," he observed. A smile touched the corners of her mouth. "My father had one. Taught me everything he knew," which was considerable. She pointed to specific components as she continued. "I've already replaced the filter and flushed the system, but the pressure's still dropping after about 10 minutes of operation." Frank knelt beside the machine, his knee protesting. The hydraulic system on this model was notoriously finicky, but it was built to last if maintained properly. He ran his hand along a hydraulic line, feeling for abnormalities. "You're not from around here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Moved to the old Jensen property last month." She watched his hands with interest. "Planning to restore it, maybe grow some specialized crops." Frank grunted. The Jensen place had been abandoned since old man Jensen died 2 years back. 300 acres of once prime farmland, now overgrown and forgotten. "Ambitious. I like a challenge." There was something in her voice, determination, perhaps, or defiance. "The land has good bones. Just needs someone willing to listen to what it needs." Frank found himself nodding. It was the kind of thing his father would have said before corporations started buying up family farms and turning agriculture into a spreadsheet exercise. "I can fix this," he said, gesturing to the tractor. "But parts will take time. This model hasn't been in production for decades." "I've got some original components I salvaged from another unit," Rachel replied. "They're at my place. If you're willing to make a house call, we might save some time." Frank hesitated. House calls meant leaving the shop unattended, and he had 3 other jobs waiting. But something about this woman and her classic tractor intrigued him. Nobody restored old equipment these days unless they understood its value beyond mere utility. "I can come by tomorrow morning," he found himself saying. "Early, before my other appointments." Rachel nodded, satisfied. "I appreciate it, Mr. Calloway." "Frank," he corrected automatically. "Frank." She smiled again, more fully this time. "I'll have coffee waiting." As she drove away, Frank wondered why he felt he'd just agreed to something much more significant than a simple tractor repair. The Jensen property looked different than Frank remembered. When he pulled up at 7 a.m. the next day, he was surprised to see signs of serious restoration underway. The old farmhouse had fresh paint and repaired shutters. The barn roof, which had partially collapsed during last winter's heavy snows, was now fully rebuilt with new timber. Rachel greeted him on the porch, two steaming mugs in hand. "Right on time," she said, offering him coffee. Frank accepted the mug and took a sip, strong and black, just as he preferred. "You've been busy," he observed, nodding toward the improvements. "Like I said, good bones. Just needed some attention." She led him toward the barn where the dismantled tractor waited. "I appreciate you coming out. Not many mechanics would bother with a 40-year-old machine. Not many people would bother restoring one," Frank countered. "Cheaper to buy new these days." Rachel's expression hardened slightly. "Cheaper in dollars? Maybe. But there are other costs." Inside the barn, Frank was surprised to find a well-organized workshop. Tools hung in neat rows, and the tractor parts were arranged systematically on a tarp. Several original manuals sat open on a workbench, along with handwritten notes. This was not the setup of a hobbyist or a dilettante farmer. "Military?" Frank asked, recognizing the methodical organization. Rachel paused briefly. "What makes you say that?" Frank gestured around the workshop. "This level of organization, the attention to detail, you either served or you're the neatest civilian I've ever met." A smile flickered across her face. "Let's just say I've spent time in environments where precision matters." They worked together for the next few hours, falling into an easy rhythm. Rachel knew her way around tools and wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. She asked intelligent questions and offered insights that showed a deep understanding of mechanical engineering. By mid-morning, they had disassembled the hydraulic pump and identified the problem, a hairline crack in the housing that was allowing pressure to bleed off. "Can it be welded?" Rachel asked, examining the damaged component. Frank ran his finger along the crack. "Could be, but it wouldn't last. These housings are cast iron, under constant pressure, one bad temperature cycle, and you're back where you started. And I'm guessing original replacement parts aren't exactly common." "Hen's teeth," Frank confirmed. "But," he hesitated, an idea forming. "I might have something." He returned to his truck and rummaged through a large toolbox bolted to the bed. After a moment, he extracted a similar pump housing, worn but intact. "David, my brother, he used to collect parts from old equipment before they went to scrap. Said you never knew when they'd be needed." Frank turned the housing over in his hands. "This is from a 4640, slightly newer model, but the mounting pattern is identical. Internals should transfer over." Rachel accepted the part, examining it with careful fingers. "Your brother sounds like a wise man." "He was," Frank said quietly, "died 3 months ago." Rachel's eyes met his, and there was genuine sympathy there. "I'm sorry," Frank nodded, uncomfortable with the moment of vulnerability. "Let's see if this works. Shall we?" They spent another hour transferring components from the cracked housing to the replacement. When they finished, Rachel insisted on making lunch, over sandwiches eaten at her kitchen table. Their conversation shifted from tractors to the broader state of Harvest County. "I've noticed a lot of for sale signs on properties around here," Rachel observed. "Economic trouble." Frank swallowed a bite before answering. 3 major floods in 2 years. Drought this summer. Crop insurance doesn't cover everything. And banks aren't as forgiving as they used to be." He didn't mention his own precarious situation with Harvest Financial. "Specifically Harvest Financial Group?" Rachel asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. Frank set down his sandwich, suddenly wary. "You've done your homework. When you invest in a community, you learn about its pressure points." She met his gaze directly. "I've heard they've been aggressive about foreclosures lately." "That's one word for it." Frank's tone was guarded now. This conversation had ventured beyond normal small talk with a client. Rachel seemed to sense his suspicion. She stood and retrieved a folder from a drawer, placing it on the table between them. "I didn't come to Riverdale just for the farmland, Frank," she said quietly. "I'm interested in Harvest Financial's activities in this region. Specifically, their pattern of loan recalls and property acquisitions." Frank stared at the folder, but didn't open it. "Who are you really, Mrs. Morgan?" Someone who believes that what's happening in Harvest County isn't simply bad luck or economic inevitability. She tapped the folder. 17 properties foreclosed in 18 months, all acquired by subsidiaries of the same parent company that owns Harvest Financial. That's not normal banking practice. It's a land grab. Frank finally opened the folder. Inside were satellite maps of Harvest County with properties highlighted in red. His shop was among them, as were dozens of others, forming a patchwork that covered nearly half the county. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked, though a cold certainty was already forming in his gut. "Because I think your brother may have discovered the same pattern," Rachel said gently. "And I don't believe for a second that he killed himself." Frank's head snapped up, anger flashing in his eyes. "You don't know anything about my brother. I know he made 3 appointments with federal banking regulators in the weeks before his death," Rachel countered. "I know he compiled financial records from multiple property owners in the county, and I know that 2 days before he died, he sent an encrypted email that was never opened." The sandwich in Frank's stomach turned to lead. "Who the hell are you?" Rachel hesitated, then reached into her pocket and extracted an ID card, sliding it across the table. Frank picked it up, his weathered fingers tracing the emblem of the Department of Agriculture. "Margaret Wright," he read aloud. "Special Investigator, Rural Development Oversight." He looked up, confusion and anger warring on his face. "You're a Fed, I prefer Maggie," she said with a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And yes, I work for the federal government. I'm investigating potential fraud and corruption in agricultural lending practices across several states. Harvest County has the most aggressive pattern I've seen yet." Frank pushed back from the table, the legs of his chair scraping against the floor. "So this," he gestured around them, "the tractor, the repairs, all of it was just a way to pump me for information." "The tractor genuinely needed fixing," Maggie replied calmly. "But yes, I wanted to talk to you. Your brother was onto something, Frank, something big enough that someone might have wanted to silence him." Frank stood abruptly, his chair tipping over behind him. "My brother gambled away everything he had and couldn't face the consequences. That's what happened. Not some conspiracy theory cooked up by Washington bureaucrats looking to justify their paychecks." He turned to leave, but Maggie's next words stopped him cold. The gun was in his right hand. "Frank." Frank froze, his back to her. "In the police report," Maggie continued quietly, "the gun was found in his right hand, but David was left-handed. Wasn't he?" Slowly, Frank turned. "How do you know that?" Maggie held up her phone, displaying a photograph. It showed a younger David Calloway signing paperwork, pen in his left hand. "County business license application, 1992. Details matter, Frank, and this detail suggests your brother didn't shoot himself." Frank felt the room tilt slightly. The doubt that had gnawed at him since David's death, the doubt he'd tried to drown in work and whiskey, suddenly had form and substance. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why, David, why Harvest County?" Maggie gestured for him to sit. After a moment's hesitation, he righted his chair and sank into it. "I don't have all the answers yet," she admitted, "but I know that Harvest Financial isn't just foreclosing on random properties. They're targeting specific areas within the watershed of the Clearwater River, and they're doing it with unusual urgency." She pulled out another map, this one showing the topography of the county with the foreclosed properties highlighted. "See the pattern?" she asked. Frank studied the map, his engineer's mind automatically analyzing the data. The highlighted properties formed a rough semicircle around the widest part of the Clearwater Valley, with another cluster downstream near the county line. "They're boxing in the floodplain," he realized aloud. "But why? It's mostly marginal farmland, prone to flooding." "Exactly marginal for farming," Maggie agreed, "but perfect for something else." She pointed to a small notation on the map near the downstream cluster. "What's this area called locally?" Frank squinted at the location. "Eagles Gorge. It's a narrow point in the river valley, steep rock walls on either side." His eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Christ, they're planning a dam." Maggie nodded grimly. A private hydroelectric project. Very quiet, very lucrative, and very destructive to the upstream communities which conveniently they'll already own through foreclosure. Frank's mind raced. If they dammed the Clearwater at Eagles Gorge, the resulting reservoir would flood nearly a third of the county's agricultural land. Hundreds of families would be displaced, generations of history underwater. David found out, he said, the pieces falling into place. That's why they killed him. I believe so, Maggie confirmed. But believing isn't proving, and without proof, we can't stop them. Frank looked again at the map, at the highlighted properties, homes, and businesses belonging to people he'd known his entire life, people whose equipment he'd fixed, whose children he'd watched grow up. His shop was marked too, a small red dot in a sea of impending disaster. What do you need from me? He asked, his decision made. Access, Maggie replied. You know everyone in this county. You've been in their homes, their barns, their businesses. They trust you. I need to understand what David discovered and why it got him killed. Frank nodded slowly. And in return, I'll help you find justice for your brother. And maybe, just maybe, save Harvest County from being turned into a privately owned lake. Frank extended his hand across the table. Deal. As they shook, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a pact with forces far beyond his control. But for David and for the county they both loved, he'd walk straight into hell if that's what it took. The next morning found Frank at the Matthews farm, ostensibly to check on their backup tractor before they attempted to salvage what remained of their harvest. In reality, he was following Maggie's suggestion to review their loan documents from Harvest Financial. I appreciate you coming, Frank, Robert Matthews said as they walked toward the equipment barn. The smell of burned crops still hung in the air, a constant reminder of their precarious situation. With the combine gone, we're down to the old International. If that goes too, he didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what was at stake. How's the family holding up? Frank asked. Matthews shrugged, his shoulders carrying the weight of generations. Sarah's scared. Can't blame her. 3 generations of Matthews worked this land, and I might be the one who loses it. You're not the only one feeling the squeeze, Frank said carefully. Bank troubles. Matthews glanced around, though there was no one else nearby. Harvest Financial. Loan terms changed after that merger last year. Interest rate nearly doubled. Mind if I take a look? Might see something your lawyer missed. The farmer hesitated only briefly before nodding. Worth a shot. Papers are in the house. As they turned toward the farmhouse, the distant sound of an approaching vehicle made them both look up. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows was coming up the long drive, dust billowing behind it. Expecting company? Frank asked. Matthews shook his head, a grim set to his jaw. Banker hours. Must be important. The SUV pulled to a stop, and 2 men emerged. The first was Reed Walker, Harvest Financial's regional manager, a thin man with cold eyes who'd taken over after the merger. Frank had dealt with him briefly after David's death, found him to be all policy and no humanity. The second man was a stranger, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the bearing of someone used to command. Despite the casual clothing, jeans and a flannel shirt that looked too new, Frank immediately pegged him as military, or former military. Something in the posture, the way he scanned the surroundings before moving forward. Mr. Matthews, Walker called, his voice carrying the practiced concern of a man delivering bad news he secretly relished. Got a minute to talk? Matthews stepped forward, positioning himself between the visitors and his home. About insurance assessment on your combine and your outstanding loan balance. Walker gestured to his companion. This is Victor Harrington, representing our parent company's development division. He'd like to discuss some options that might benefit everyone. Frank studied Harrington more carefully. The name tugged at something in his memory, but he couldn't place it. Mr. Matthews. Harrington stepped forward, hand extended. His voice was deep, authoritative. Terrible about your equipment, but perhaps an opportunity in disguise. Matthews reluctantly shook the offered hand. What kind of opportunity comes from losing half my harvest? The kind that provides a fresh start, Harrington replied smoothly. Our company is interested in acquiring properties in this region for a major development project. We're prepared to offer generous terms enough to settle your outstanding loans and relocate your family comfortably. Relocate, Matthews repeated, as if the word was foreign. This is my home, and a fine one, Harrington agreed, his tone sympathetic but firm. But farming in this region is becoming increasingly untenable. Climate change, water rights issues, equipment costs. Our offer represents security in uncertain times. Frank stepped forward. Funny timing, your offer. Right after a convenient equipment failure? Harrington's gaze shifted to Frank, and a flash of something recognition annoyance crossed his face before it resumed its mask of professional cordiality. Frank Calloway, he said, extending his hand. Victor Harrington, your reputation precedes you? Frank didn't take the offered hand. Wish I could say the same. An awkward silence followed, broken by Walker clearing his throat. Perhaps we could continue this conversation inside. Mr. Matthews? The details are better discussed in private. Matthews looked torn, caught between hospitality and suspicion. Finally, he nodded. Sarah just made coffee, but I'm not making any decisions today. As the three men headed toward the house, Frank held back. I'll finish checking that tractor, he called to Matthews. Let me know when you're done with your guess. Matthews nodded gratefully, while Harrington gave Frank a final assessing look before following the farmer inside. Instead of heading to the equipment barn, Frank circled around to his truck and grabbed his phone. He dialed Maggie's number, which she'd programmed into his phone under R. Morgan. She answered on the second ring. Frank, everything okay? We've got company at the Matthews place, he said quietly, keeping an eye on the house. Reed Walker from Harvest Financial and someone named Victor Harrington. Says he's from their development division, offering to buy the Matthews out right after their combine conveniently went up in flames. A pause on the other end. Victor Harrington. You're sure? That's what he said. Tall, silver hair, military bearing. Know him, of him, Maggie replied, her voice tight. He's not from any development division. Victor Harrington is a former state senator and current managing director of Clear Peak Energy. They specialize in private hydroelectric projects. The pieces clicked into place. The dam, Frank said. They're not even trying to hide it anymore. They must be accelerating their timeline, Maggie said. Can you stay there? See what kind of offer they're making. Already planned to. Frank glanced toward the house, where shadows moved behind curtained windows. There's something else. Harrington, he seemed to recognize me. Said my reputation preceded me. Be careful, Frank. If they know you're asking questions, I'm always careful, he replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. I'll call you when they leave. Frank ended the call and headed toward the equipment barn, his mind racing. Clear Peak Energy. The name was vaguely familiar perhaps from one of David's files if Harrington was involved directly. This was bigger than just a local bank squeezing farmers. Much bigger. Inside the barn. Frank went through the motions of checking the old International tractor, but his attention remained on the house. After about 20 minutes, the door opened, and the three men emerged. Matthew's face was ashen, his posture defeated in a way Frank had never seen before. Walker and Harrington returned to their SUV, but before getting in, Harrington turned and looked directly at the equipment barn, as if he knew Frank was watching. Even at this distance, Frank could see the cold smile that curled the man's lips. A chill ran down his spine, not of fear, but of recognition. Somehow, he knew this man, and somehow, this man knew him. As the SUV pulled away, Frank walked over to Matthews, who stood frozen in his driveway. Robert, Frank prompted gently. What happened in there? Matthews turned to him, eyes hollow. They know everything. Frank, my loans, my insurance, Even the grain futures contracts I signed last spring. They had it all laid out how I can't possibly make the payments, even if I'd saved the whole harvest. What did they offer? 1.2 million for the entire property. Enough to clear my debts and have maybe 100,000 left over. He laughed bitterly. 100,000 for 3 generations of sweat and blood? Frank placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. And if you refuse, foreclosure within 60 days, just in time for winter. Matthews looked toward the house, where Sarah watched anxiously from the window. What choice do I have? Don't sign anything yet, Frank urged. Give me a few days. There might be options we haven't considered. Matthews gave him a weary look. Like what a miracle Frank thought of Maggie, of David's hidden discoveries, of the larger game being played across Harvest County. Something like that, he said. Trust me, Robert, just a few days. Frank was halfway back to his shop when the truck's engine coughed and died. He coasted to the shoulder of the county road, surrounded by empty fields on both sides. No other vehicles in sight. Perfect, he muttered, popping the hood. The problem was immediately apparent. The fuel line had been cut clean through. Not torn, not worn cut. Frank's combat instincts, dulled but not forgotten after decades of civilian life, flared to life. He scanned the area, noting a stand of trees about 100 yards off the road. Perfect cover for someone watching the road. He pulled out his phone to call Maggie, but there was no signal. Also not a coincidence. He suspected. Frank reached under the seat and extracted the 9mm handgun he'd kept there since returning from Afghanistan. He hadn't fired it in years, but some habits died hard. Checking that it was loaded, he tucked it into his waistband at the small of his back. The smart move would be to stay with the vehicle and wait for another car to pass. But if someone had sabotaged his truck, they'd likely circled back to make sure their plan had worked. Waiting made him an easy target. Decision made. Frank grabbed his toolbox from the truck bed. Not just for show, the heavy metal box contained tools that could double as weapons in a pinch, and its weight was reassuring in his hand. He set off across the field toward a distant line of trees that would eventually lead back to town. The direct route would have been the road itself, but that's where they'd expect him to go. 20 years in combat zones had taught Frank that predictability was a quick path to a shallow grave. He'd covered about a quarter mile when he heard the engine, the distinctive rumble of a diesel pickup approaching from the direction he'd come. Frank dropped to a crouch among the unharvested wheat, watching as a mud-splattered truck slowed near his abandoned vehicle. 2 men got out, both wearing work clothes that might have passed for ordinary farmers, if not for their too clean boots and the suspicious bulges under their jackets. They checked Frank's truck, then scanned the surrounding fields. One pointed in Frank's direction, and they both started walking toward him. Not even trying to be subtle, Frank muttered, backing deeper into the wheat. He had maybe 2 minutes before they reached his position. Looking around for options, Frank spotted a rusted piece of farm equipment half hidden in the tall grass, an old disc harrow abandoned when it broke. Too heavy to easily transport back for repairs. It would provide cover, and more importantly, materials. Frank hurried to the harrow, setting down his toolbox and quickly assessing what he had to work with. The disc blades were still intact, connected to a heavy metal frame. Each disc was about 2 feet in diameter, with sharpened edges designed to cut through soil. Working quickly, Frank used a wrench from his toolbox to free one of the disc blades. The rusted bolts fought him, but decades of mechanical work had given his hands strength that belied his age. The disc came free just as he heard the men approaching, their footsteps crunching through the dry wheat. "He can't have gone far," one voice said. "Old man like that, bad knee. Check that equipment over there." Frank positioned himself behind the harrow, disc blade in one hand, wrench in the other. He could use the gun, but gunshots would be heard for miles in this open country. Better to handle this quietly if possible. The first man rounded the harrow, a pistol already drawn. He never saw the disc blade that caught him across the forearm, opening a deep gash that caused him to drop his weapon with a howl of pain. Frank followed immediately with a strike from the heavy wrench to the side of the man's head, dropping him unconscious to the ground. The second attacker was more cautious, keeping his distance and raising his own weapon. "Don't move, young old man," he ordered, his aim steady despite his partner's fate. Frank raised his hand slowly, the disc blade still clutched in one. "Quite the welcome wagon Harvest County's got these days," he said conversationally. "First the bank takes your property, then they send goons to cut your fuel line. Full service." The man's eyes narrowed. "You don't know when to mind your own business? Calloway, just like your brother." A cold rage settled in Frank's chest. "So you knew David, knew he was a problem, just like you're becoming." The man gestured with his gun. "Drop the blade and the wrench. We're going for a ride." Frank weighed his options. The gunman was too far away for a rush, and a thrown disc might not reach him with sufficient force. He needed to change the dynamics of the confrontation. Slowly, Frank lowered the disc to the ground. "Can I ask you something before we go?" he asked, straightening back up, hands raised. The gunman shrugged. "Knock yourself out. How much is Harrington paying you to do his dirty work?" A flicker of surprise crossed the man's face at the name. "Enough! Now the wrench too!" Frank nodded as if in compliance, then suddenly hurled the heavy wrench with all his strength. The tool spun through the air, not at the gunman, but at the ground several feet in front of him, sending up a spray of dirt and gravel that momentarily distracted him. In that split second, Frank dove for the discarded pistol of the first attacker. He rolled, came up with the weapon, and fired in one fluid motion. The bullet caught the second man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own shot wild into the sky. Frank was on him before he could recover, delivering a savage blow to the jaw that put him down beside his partner. Both men were still breathing, but neither would be a threat for some time. Frank quickly searched them, finding no identification but relieving them of their weapons and phones. One of the phones had signal not surprising if they'd been using a portable jammer that affected only the immediate area around his truck. He dialed Maggie's number with bloodied fingers. "Frank," she answered, concerned. "I've been trying to reach you." "Had a bit of trouble," he replied, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. "Someone cut my fuel line and sent a welcome party. 2 men, armed, waiting for me to break down. They mentioned David and Harrington." Maggie's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing permanent. They came off worse." Frank glanced at the unconscious men. "But this confirms everything. Doesn't it David was murdered, and they just tried to do the same to me?" "Where are you?" Maggie asked. "I'll come get you." "County Road 27, about 5 miles east of the Matthews place." Frank checked his watch. "But we need to move fast. These two will have friends wondering where they are before long. Stay hidden. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Frank ended the call and quickly bound the 2 men with zip ties from his toolbox, another habit from his military days that had proven useful. He dragged them behind the harrow where they wouldn't be visible from the road, then gathered the weapons and phones. As he waited for Maggie, Frank examined the men's belongings more carefully. No wallets, no ID professional. But one had a matchbook from the Silver Dollar Saloon in his pocket, a dive bar on the outskirts of Riverdale that had recently changed ownership. Frank pocketed it, adding another piece to the puzzle. The sound of an approaching vehicle sent him back into cover, pistol ready, but it was Maggie's pickup that pulled onto the shoulder near his disabled truck. Frank emerged cautiously, checking for any signs of surveillance before jogging across the field to meet her. "Jesus, Frank," she said as he approached, taking in his dirt-streaked appearance and the blood on his hands. "What happened to—" "I'm always careful." "This was the careful version," he replied, climbing into the passenger seat. "The reckless version would have involved a lot more shooting." As they pulled away, Frank filled her in on the details of the attack. Maggie listened intently, her expression growing darker with each detail. "We need to get you somewhere safe," she said when he finished. "If Harrington's people are willing to make such a direct move, they must be desperate or confident they can operate with impunity." "I'm not running," Frank stated flatly. "Not when we're finally getting answers about David." "I'm not suggesting running," Maggie countered. I'm suggesting strategic relocation. My place has security systems that would make the Pentagon jealous, and it's already swept for bugs. We can regroup there, figure out our next move. Frank nodded reluctantly. First, we need to stop by my shop. There are some files of David's I kept locked away. Might be time to take another look. Maggie hesitated, then nodded. Quick in and out. If they came after you once, they'll try again. As they drove toward Riverdale, Frank found himself studying Maggie's profile. You're not just some Department of Agriculture investigator, are you? He asked finally. A small smile touched her lips. Let's just say my expertise extends beyond crop subsidies and rural development. NASA engineer, my ass, Frank muttered. Oh, I did work at NASA, Maggie replied. Orbital mechanics and guidance systems. But before that, she shrugged. Let's just say I've had varied employment opportunities within the federal government. Intelligence? Frank guessed. Among other things. She glanced at him. Does that bother you? Frank considered the question. Normally, I'd say yes. Never been fond of government types poking around in local business. He flexed his bloodied knuckles. But since the alternative seems to be getting ambushed in wheat fields by corporate hitmen, I'll make an exception. Maggie's laugh was unexpectedly warm. You Calloway brothers never did choose the easy path. Did you? The casual reference to David, spoken with what seemed like genuine familiarity, caught Frank off guard. You knew him before all this. Her expression softened. Not well, but we corresponded about some irregularities he'd noticed in local water rights acquisitions. He was smart, frank, and thorough. If he hadn't reached out to my department, we might never have connected the dots on Clear Peak's activities. A complicated mix of pride and grief tightened Frank's chest. Even at the end, drowning in gambling debts and alcohol, David had still been trying to protect their community, and it had cost him his life. Then let's make sure his work wasn't for nothing, Frank said as they approached the outskirts of Riverdale, and that whoever killed him pays the price. The determined set of Maggie's jaw told him she had every intention of doing exactly that. Frank's shop appeared undisturbed when they arrived, but neither of them took chances. Maggie circled the building once while Frank checked the entrances for signs of tampering. Finding none, they entered through the back door, Frank leading the way with his borrowed pistol at the ready. The familiar smell of oil and metal greeted them, the scent of Frank's entire adult life. The main workspace was exactly as he'd left it, tools neatly arranged, half-repaired equipment waiting patiently for attention they might never receive if Harvest Financial had its way. David's files are in the office, Frank said, moving toward the small room at the rear of the shop. In the floor safe, the office was cluttered but organized in Frank's own particular system. Invoices were sorted by month in stackable trays. Parts catalogs filled a bookshelf, and framed photographs covered one wall, a visual history of Callaway repairs from its founding to the present day. Frank moved behind the desk and pulled aside the worn area rug, revealing a floor safe built into the concrete. The combination was simple: David's service number, followed by Frank's own. The brothers had installed the safe together when they expanded the shop in the late 90s, joking that they needed somewhere to hide their millions when they finally struck it rich. The safe contained a few items of sentimental value: their father's pocket watch, their mother's wedding ring, along with an envelope of cash for emergencies, in a fireproof document case. It was this last item that Frank extracted, placing it on the desk. After David died, he explained as he opened the case, I packed up his personal papers. Most went to storage, but these, he gestured to the contents, a collection of notebooks, USB drives, and file folders. These seemed important. He'd been acting strange those last few months. Secretive. I thought it might have been related to his gambling. But now... Maggie began examining the materials. Did you look through these before? Frank shook his head. Didn't have the heart, and honestly, I was afraid of what I might find: more debts, more problems I couldn't fix. The first notebook contained what appeared to be financial records for various properties in Harvest County, with notes in David's precise handwriting highlighting unusual patterns in loan terms and interest rates. The second held maps similar to the ones Maggie had shown Frank, with properties marked and dated. He was tracking the acquisitions, Maggie observed, turning pages. Just like I was, but with better local intelligence. Frank opened a file folder containing newspaper clippings about water rights legislation and proposed changes to the state's eminent domain laws. Another held printouts of email correspondence between David and various property owners who'd been approached by Harvest Financial with buyout offers. "My brother the investigator," Frank murmured, a mixture of pride and sorrow in his voice. "I never knew." Maggie inserted one of the USB drives into her laptop. It contained more data spreadsheets tracking property values, water rights allocations, and what appeared to be geological surveys of the Clearwater River Basin. "This is incredible," she said, scrolling through the files. "David compiled more information than my entire department. With this, we might actually have enough to—" A sharp crack interrupted her, the distinctive sound of breaking glass from the main shop area. Frank immediately grabbed his pistol from the desk, moving to position himself between Maggie and the office door. "Back door," he whispered. "Go!" But Maggie was already reaching into her jacket, extracting a compact semi-automatic that looked far more professional than Frank's borrowed weapon. "2 entrances, 2 defenders," she countered quietly. "Better odds." Before Frank could argue, the lights went out, plunging the shop into semi-darkness, broken only by slivers of late-afternoon sun through the small windows. The distinctive metallic click of a shotgun being racked echoed through the space. "Calloway," a voice called out. "We know you're here. Make this easy on yourself." Frank recognized the voice, one of the men who'd visited Matthews with Reed Walker earlier. Not Harrington, but one of his associates. Frank edged to the office doorway, trying to get a visual on their attackers without exposing himself. "How many?" Maggie mouthed silently. Frank held up 3 fingers, then pointed to positions around the shop where he'd glimpsed movement. 3 men, armed, spreading out to cover both exits. Professional, just like the ones who'd ambushed him earlier. "Clear Peak Security," he whispered. "Military contractors, not local muscle." Maggie nodded, understanding the distinction. These weren't ordinary bank goons, they were trained operators, likely with combat experience, the kind who knew how to clear a building and wouldn't hesitate to use lethal force. "Calloway," the voice called again. "Last chance to walk out on your own power." Frank glanced around the office, assessing their options. The back window was too small for an adult to fit through, and the only other exit led directly into the shop where the intruders waited. They were effectively cornered, but being cornered didn't mean being helpless. Not in a machine shop with 2 combat veterans. Frank moved to his desk and scribbled a quick note. "Distraction in 30 seconds, then we move." He showed it to Maggie, who nodded sharply. Reaching into the bottom desk drawer, Frank extracted a road flare, part of the emergency kit he kept for winter breakdowns. He struck it against the desk edge, the magnesium igniter sparking to life with a brilliant crimson flame and billowing smoke. In one fluid motion, he hurled the flare through the office doorway into the main shop area, directly toward a stack of oil-soaked rags near the workbench. The rags caught immediately, flames leaping up toward the ceiling and casting wild, dancing shadows throughout the space. The sudden fire had the desired effect. Shouts of alarm and confusion erupted from their attackers. One man discharged his shotgun reflexively, the blast deafening in the enclosed space. "Now!" Frank yelled, and they both moved from the office into the chaos of the smoke-filled shop. Frank caught sight of the nearest attacker, momentarily outlined against the flames as he tried to orient himself. Without hesitation, Frank tackled him, driving them both into a shelving unit that collapsed under their combined weight. Tools and parts rained down, adding to the confusion. The man was younger and stronger, but Frank had decades of hard-won experience and the desperate energy of someone fighting for answers about his brother's death. They grappled amid the fallen tools, each seeking advantage. Frank's opponent managed to get a hand free and drew a knife from his belt. The blade slashed across Frank's forearm, opening a shallow but painful cut. Frank responded by seizing a heavy wrench from the floor and bringing it down hard on the man's wrist. Bone cracked audibly, and the knife clattered away. Elsewhere in the shop, Frank could hear Maggie engaged in her own fight. The sharp report of her pistol, followed by a cry of pain, told him she was holding her own. The fire was spreading now, consuming workbenches and equipment. The shop's sprinkler system should have activated, but it remained ominously silent, sabotaged, most likely by the intruders before their attack. Frank finally subdued his opponent with a vicious strike to the temple that left him limp on the oil-stained concrete. Retrieving his pistol from where it had fallen during the struggle, Frank moved toward the sound of continuing combat, staying low to avoid the thickening smoke. He found Maggie pinned down behind an ancient drill press, exchanging fire with the remaining two attackers who had taken cover behind a tractor Frank had been repairing. One man was nursing what appeared to be a gunshot wound to the leg, while the other was trying to flank Maggie's position. Frank took aim at the flanking attacker and fired twice. The first shot missed, pinging off metal, but the second caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around with a shout of pain and surprise. "Frank," Maggie called, spotting him through the smoke. "We need to get out." The fire. She was right. The flames had reached a shelf of solvents and lubricants, which were beginning to pop and explode in the heat, sending burning liquids spattering across the shop. The entire building would be fully engulfed within minutes. "The files!" Frank shouted back, remembering David's research still in the office. "Got them!" Maggie patted her jacket, where she'd apparently stashed the thumb drives and most critical documents. "East door, go." Frank provided covering fire as Maggie broke from her position and sprinted toward the exit. The remaining attacker, realizing their plan was falling apart and the building becoming a death trap, chose discretion over valor and followed his wounded companion toward the main entrance. Smoke was now so thick that Frank could barely see 3 feet ahead. He staggered toward where he thought the east door should be, lungs burning, eyes streaming. A hand seized his arm, Maggie, guiding him the final few yards to safety. They burst through the door into the clean evening air, gasping and coughing. Behind them, Frank's shop, the business his brother had built, that he had maintained for decades, was being consumed by flames. Decades of work, of memories, of service to the community, all disappearing in fire and smoke. "Frank," Maggie's voice cut through his dazed observation. "We need to move. Now." She was right. Sirens were already wailing in the distance, fire trucks responding to the blaze. And where there were officials, there would soon be questions they weren't ready to answer. As they hurried to Maggie's truck, Frank cast one last glance at the burning building. Among the many losses in that fire was any chance of returning to his old life. Whoever had killed David and tried to kill him had just ensured that Frank Calloway had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous enemy of all. The flames from Frank's shop painted the night sky orange, visible for miles across the flat Montana landscape. From their vantage point on a hilltop outside town, Frank and Maggie watched as fire crews battled the blaze that had consumed 4 decades of Frank's life. "They won't save it," Frank said flatly, his voice rough from smoke inhalation. "Too much fuel in there. Oil, solvents, propane tanks in the back room." As if to confirm his assessment, a muffled explosion sent a fresh plume of sparks skyward. Maggie stood beside him, her laptop balanced on the hood of her truck as she methodically downloaded files from David's USB drives. The glow of the screen illuminated her face, revealing a mix of concentration and concern. "Frank," she said gently, "we need to go. Sheriff's Department will be looking for you once they identify your shop." "Let them look," Frank replied, still staring at the inferno. "I've got nothing left to hide. Nothing except evidence of corporate conspiracy, murder, and environmental fraud." Maggie countered. "Not to mention our firefight with private military contractors. We need time to organize this information and get it to people who can act on it. Frank finally turned away from the burning shop. Blood had dried on his forearm where the knife had caught him, and soot streaked his weathered face. In the orange glow of the distant fire, he looked older, harder, a man transformed by loss into something dangerous. "You're the government investigator," he said. "Why not just call in the FBI, the state police? Get a warrant for Harvest Financial's records." Maggie closed her laptop, her expression grim. "Because Victor Harrington has friends in very high places. Frank, 2 governors, a senator, numerous state officials, all beneficiaries of his political donations. Any premature move through official channels would be shut down before it started. And your own agency, compromised, potentially, someone leaked information about David's contact with us. That's why I came here unofficially to verify his claims before bringing in a team I trust completely." Frank absorbed this, nodding slowly. "So we're on our own. For now," Maggie confirmed, "but not without resources." She gestured to the laptop. "David gave us a roadmap. We just need to follow it to its conclusion." Frank stared once more at his burning livelihood, committing the image to memory. Then he climbed into Maggie's truck without another word. Whatever came next, there was no going back. The Jensen property, now Maggie's operational base, was dark when they arrived, the farmhouse silhouette barely visible against the night sky. Maggie bypassed the main drive, instead taking a narrow access road that curved behind the barn to a modern steel outbuilding that hadn't been visible during Frank's previous visit. "Panic room," Frank asked as Maggie unlocked the reinforced door. "Command center," she corrected, flipping switches that illuminated an interior unlike anything Frank had expected on a Montana farm. The space was essentially a high-tech office built inside an agricultural shell. Computer workstations lined one wall, while large monitors displayed satellite imagery, news feeds, and what appeared to be financial data streams. A secure communications array occupied one corner, and a small armory locked behind a metal cage filled another. The remaining space contained living quarters, a kitchenette, bathroom, and 2 cots that could be curtained off for privacy. "Department of Agriculture has generous equipment budgets these days," Frank observed dryly. Maggie's lips twitched in a fleeting smile. "Let's just say this operation draws from multiple federal resources." She moved to a medical cabinet and extracted supplies. "Sit. That cut needs cleaning," Frank complied, sinking into an office chair while Maggie attended to his wounded arm. Her hands were gentle but efficient, cleaning the gash with antiseptic before applying butterfly closures. "Should have stitches," she commented. "Had worse in the field," Frank replied. "It'll hold." As she worked, Frank studied the monitors. One displayed a news feed from the local station, showing footage of his shop engulfed in flames. The ticker at the bottom read, "Local business destroyed in suspected arson. Owner missing. They're not wasting any time painting me as a suspect," he noted. "Standard procedure when they can't find the property owner," Maggie replied, finishing with his arm. "But it works in our favor, gives us time to work without you being immediately sought for questioning." Frank's gaze shifted to another monitor, this one showing a map of Harvest County with properties highlighted in different colors. "David's data," Maggie nodded, moving to the main workstation. "I've been collating it with my own research. The pattern is clear once you know what to look for." She typed briefly, and the map zoomed in on Eagles Gorge. "This is where they plan to build the dam, a hydroelectric project with an estimated output of 200 megawatts, enough to power several counties, with surplus to sell back to the grid. And flood a third of Harvest County in the process," Frank added. "Precisely. The properties they've acquired or targeted for foreclosure create a perfect perimeter around the future reservoir." She highlighted another area on the map. "But here's where it gets interesting. David found something they didn't want anyone to see." The map shifted to a geological survey of the area, with certain formations marked in red. "What am I looking at?" Frank asked, leaning closer. "Rare earth mineral deposits," Maggie explained. "Specifically, neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium critical components for everything from wind turbines to military guidance systems. Currently, the U.S. imports over 80% of these materials from China. Understanding dawned. So the dam is just a cover. A profitable cover, Maggie corrected. Harrington gets to present himself as a champion of clean energy while simultaneously securing access to mineral deposits worth billions. The flooded valley will require extensive excavation for the dam foundation, giving them the perfect opportunity to extract these materials without the scrutiny of a traditional mining operation. Frank's mind raced. And my brother figured this out. He did more than figure it out, Maggie said, inserting another of David's USB drives. He traced the ownership structure of Clear Peak Energy through a dozen shell companies back to its ultimate parent, Harrington Strategic Resources. Victor Harrington's company, his private empire, Maggie confirmed. Defense contracts, energy projects, resource extraction, all carefully compartmentalized to avoid connecting the dots. Until David did exactly that. Frank stared at the screen, watching as a complex web of corporate entities resolved into a clear picture of deliberate deception. His brother, drowning in gambling debts and personal demons, had nonetheless pieced together a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of state power. They killed him for this, Frank said quietly. They tried to make it look like suicide, Maggie corrected. But they made mistakes. The right-handed gun placement, the timing of his death right after he contacted federal authorities. And this, she pulled up an email David had sent just hours before his death. The message was addressed to a secure government server and contained only a brief note. Found the connection. Harrington isn't just financing the foreclosures, he's orchestrating them. Sending full documentation tomorrow. DRC. Frank read it twice, each word cementing his resolve. What's our next move? Maggie pulled up another file, a calendar of local events. Tomorrow night, Harvest Financial is hosting a community information session at the county fairgrounds. Officially, it's about agricultural lending programs. Unofficially, they're going to announce the dam project, Frank finished. Most likely, Maggie agreed. Victor Harrington himself is scheduled to attend, along with state water resource officials and representatives from the governor's economic development team. They'll present it as a lifeline for a struggling agricultural region, clean energy, jobs, progress, while conveniently omitting the part about flooding people's homes and stealing resources from beneath their feet. Frank added bitterly, exactly. But with David's research, we can disrupt their narrative. We just need to get to the right people with this information before Harrington's political allies can bury it. Frank studied the event details. An idea forming. I know most of the security staff at the fairgrounds. Local guys, former deputies mostly. If we need access. We'll need more than access, Maggie cautioned. After today, you're likely to be recognized. And if Harrington's security team is there, the same ones who tried to kill us today, Frank nodded. But they'll be expecting us to keep our distance after what happened. They won't anticipate a direct confrontation in a public forum. Because it would be suicide, Maggie pointed out. Not if we have leverage, Frank countered. He pointed to a file on one of the screens, David's tracking of Harvest Financial's loan manipulations. My brother documented illegal interest rate adjustments, fraudulent appraisals, and coordinated pressure on specific property owners. If we can get this information to the property owners attending that meeting, right as Harrington is making his pitch, we could trigger a very public revolt, Maggie finished, understanding dawning. But we'd need irrefutable evidence, something so clear that even Harrington's political connections couldn't dismiss it. Frank thought for a moment, then straightened suddenly. The Matthews loan documents. Robert said the terms changed after the merger last year. Interest rates nearly doubled. If that pattern holds across multiple properties, we could prove systematic fraud. Maggie nodded, already typing. But we'd need to collect loan documents from multiple property owners, compare them to the bank's internal records, which we don't have access to, Frank concluded, deflating slightly. Maggie's typing paused, and a slow smile spread across her face. Actually, we might. David was thorough. Remember, he didn't just track the foreclosures, he followed the money. She pulled up another file, this one showing access credentials to a secure server. He had an inside source at Harvest Financial, someone who provided him with internal banking records. Frank leaned forward, hope rekindling. Who? He used a code name in his notes, Ledger. No identification beyond that. But whoever it was had high-level access to the bank's systems. Can we contact them? I'm not sure, Maggie admitted. The last communication David recorded was 3 days before his death. After that, nothing. Frank considered this. If they worked at the bank, they might be at this community meeting tomorrow. A way to pass information without risking electronic communication. Possible, Maggie agreed. But how would we identify them, or they us? Frank thought of his brother meticulous, cautious David, who always had a backup plan. There has to be a recognition protocol in his notes, something that would let his source know we're carrying on his work. They spent the next hour combing through David's files, looking for any hint of how he communicated with his inside source. Finally, in a seemingly innocuous document labeled Maintenance Schedule, they found it a series of equipment part numbers that, when converted from their alphanumeric codes, spelled out a simple message protocol. Clever bastard, Frank murmured with grudging admiration. He disguised it as routine repair orders. The protocol was straightforward. David would wear a blue shop cap with the Callaway Repairs logo to meetings. His contact would carry a copy of the Harvest County Gazette folded to show the classified section. The exchange of specific phrases about equipment maintenance would confirm their identities. So tomorrow, Maggie summarized, we go to this community meeting, you wear David's cap, look for someone with the right newspaper fold, and hope they're brave enough to still be passing information after what happened to your brother. While avoiding Harrington's security team and local law enforcement who might be looking for me in connection with the shop fire, Frank added. Simple. There's another problem, Maggie said, pulling up the event details again. The meeting is scheduled for 7 p.m., but there's a private reception for community leaders at 6. That's likely where the real information will be shared. The public meeting will just be theater. Frank studied the invitation list. Robert Matthews is on here, as head of the County Agricultural Commission. Can you contact him, see if he'd be willing to help us get inside? Frank hesitated. After today's visit from Harrington, he's under enormous pressure. Asking him to take another risk. He shook his head. But there might be another way. His son, Tommy the boy I helped yesterday during the fire. He works part-time setting up events at the fairgrounds. If he's there early, he might be able to get us in through a service entrance. Maggie finished. It's risky, involving a child. He's 17 and smart as a whip, Frank countered. And his family is about to lose everything to these people. He deserves a chance to fight back. Maggie considered this, then nodded reluctantly. Contact him, but be careful. No details over the phone. We have to assume they're monitoring communications. Frank reached for his phone, then paused. They'll be tracking my number, too. Use this. Maggie handed him a satellite phone from her equipment. Bounces the signal through multiple relays, untraceable in the short term. As Frank dialed the Matthews number, he found himself wondering how many other agricultural investigators carried military-grade communications equipment and tactical weapons. Whatever Maggie's real role in the government, he was increasingly grateful for her specialized skill set. Tommy answered on the third ring, his voice cautious. Hello, Tommy, it's Frank Callaway. Mr. Callaway. The boy's voice dropped to a whisper. Everyone's looking for you. They're saying you burned down your own shop. That's not what happened, Frank replied calmly. Listen carefully. Tommy, I need your help, but it could be risky. You're working setup at the fairgrounds tomorrow for the Harvest Financial event. Right. Yeah, from noon. Why? I need to get inside before the main doors open. It's important. It could help your family keep the farm. A pause, then determination filled the young voice. The maintenance entrance on the east side. I'll unlock it at 5:30. There's a supply closet in the back hallway where you can wait. Thank you, Tommy, and remember, don't tell anyone, not even your parents. It's safer for them not to know. I understand, the boy replied, sounding older than his years. Mr. Calloway, my dad says those bank people are trying to steal our land. Is that true? Frank closed his eyes briefly. Yes, son, but we're going to try to stop them. Good, Tommy said firmly. I'll see you tomorrow. After ending the call, Frank looked up to find Maggie watching him with an unreadable expression. What? He asked. You're good with people, she observed. They trust you. Frank shrugged uncomfortably. Spent my life fixing their equipment, listening to their problems. Guess it builds a certain rapport. It's more than that, Maggie insisted. They know you care about this community. It's why David's source might still be willing to help us, even after what happened to him. Frank didn't respond, but her words settled something inside him, a purpose that went beyond personal vengeance for his brother. This was about protecting a way of life, a community that had defined him as much as he had served it. We should get some rest, Maggie suggested, gesturing to the cots. Tomorrow will be dangerous enough without sleep deprivation. Frank nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. The adrenaline that had carried him through the day's violence was fading, leaving behind pain from his injuries and a bone-deep weariness. As he settled onto one of the cots, Frank's mind drifted to David, not the troubled man of his final years, but the brother who had welcomed him home from war, who had built a business that served their community, who had ultimately given his life trying to protect it. Tomorrow, one way or another, Frank would ensure that sacrifice wasn't in vain. The Harvest County Fairgrounds had hosted everything from rodeos to weddings in its century-long history, but Frank doubted it had ever been the site of a conspiracy as far-reaching as the one about to unfold in its main exhibition hall. From their position in a maintenance truck parked behind the agricultural building, Frank and Maggie had a clear view of arriving vehicles, a steady stream of SUVs and luxury sedans that seemed out of place in the rural setting. Harrington's here, Maggie observed, lowering her binoculars. Black Suburban with security vehicles front and back, just pulled up to the main entrance. Frank checked his watch, 5:25 p.m. We need to move. Tommy should have the door unlocked in 5 minutes. They had spent the day analyzing David's files, creating information packets to distribute to attendees, and formulating contingency plans. Frank wore David's blue Callaway Repairs cap pulled low over his eyes, with a maintenance uniform borrowed from Maggie's seemingly endless supply of operational equipment. Maggie herself was dressed in business attire, her credentials identifying her as a representative from the State Agricultural Extension Office, a cover identity backed by expertly forged documentation. Remember, Maggie said as they gathered their equipment, our primary objective is to identify David's source and secure whatever additional information they have. Exposing Harrington is secondary. Understood, Frank replied, though in his heart, confronting his brother's killer held equal importance. They approached the fairgrounds separately, Frank through the service areas, Maggie via a side entrance used by event staff. As promised, Tommy had left the maintenance door unlocked, with a handwritten, out-of-order sign taped to the outside to discourage others from using it. The service corridors were deserted as Frank made his way to the supply closet Tommy had indicated. It was cramped, but offered a perfect vantage point through a ventilation grate that overlooked the main hall. Through it, Frank could see the room being prepared for the evening's event. A stage had been erected at one end, with a podium bearing the Harvest Financial logo. Behind it hung a large screen currently displaying the bank's corporate imagery. At precisely 5:45, Frank's earpiece crackled with Maggie's voice. I'm in. Position. Supply closet, east corridor, he replied softly. I can see the main hall. Security presence. 4 at the main entrance. 2 roaming the perimeter. Professional, not local. Almost certainly the same outfit from yesterday. Frank tensed. Can you identify any negative? But they're scanning faces, not just checking invitations. They're looking for someone. Us, Frank concluded grimly. Most likely. Stick to the plan. Private reception starts in 15 minutes. I'll circulate. Look for David's contact. You monitor from your position until I give the signal. The next hour was an exercise in patience as Frank watched the room fill with Harvest County's influential citizens, business owners, large landholders, local officials. Robert Matthews arrived looking uncomfortable in a suit that hadn't seen use since his wedding day. Sheriff Leona Blackburn came in uniform, her expression guarded as she surveyed the gathering. Through his earpiece, Frank heard Maggie's occasional murmured observations as she moved through the crowd, seeking anyone matching the description of David's contact. So far, no one had been spotted with the telltale folded newspaper. At 6:30 precisely, Victor Harrington took the stage. In person, he cut an impressive figure, tall, distinguished, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to power. His voice, when he addressed the assembled guests, carried the practiced warmth of a seasoned politician. Friends, thank you for joining us this evening for what I believe will be a historic moment for Harvest County. Harrington began. For too long, this remarkable community has faced economic headwinds beyond its control, changing climate patterns, volatile commodity prices, increasing competition from industrial agriculture. Frank watched the audience nodding in agreement, their faces reflecting the daily struggles of rural life. Harrington was good, he understood his audience and knew exactly which buttons to push. Today, I'm proud to announce a project that will transform these challenges into opportunities. Harrington continued. Clearwater Energy Initiative, a state-of-the-art hydroelectric facility that will create hundreds of jobs, provide clean energy for thousands of homes, and establish Harvest County as a leader in America's energy future. The screen behind him changed to show architectural renderings of a massive dam spanning Eagles Gorge, with a gleaming power plant at its base. The assembled crowd murmured with interest, clearly impressed by the scale of the proposal. Of course, a project of this magnitude requires certain adjustments to existing land use. Harrington continued smoothly. Some properties will need to be acquired to create the reservoir that will power our turbines. But I assure you, Harvest Financial is committed to ensuring fair compensation for all affected landowners. Frank's grip tightened on the edge of the ventilation grate. Adjustments to existing land use, he muttered. That's one way to describe forcing people from their homes. His earpiece crackled. Frank, Maggie's voice was urgent. Third row, woman in a navy blazer. She's got the newspaper. Frank shifted his position to get a better view. The woman sat rigidly in her chair, a copy of the Harvest County Gazette folded to display the classified section resting in her lap. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with sleek, dark hair pulled back in a professional bun. Something about her seemed vaguely familiar, though Frank couldn't immediately place her. I see her, he confirmed. Do you have an ID? Not yet. She's keeping to herself, not engaging with others. Definitely nervous about something. On stage, Harrington was now introducing Reed Walker, who began detailing the generous relocation packages being offered to affected property owners. The terms sounded impressive when presented in corporate jargon, but Frank knew from the Matthews experience that they amounted to pennies on the dollar for land that had been in families for generations. I'm going to approach her, Maggie decided. Be ready to move if things go sideways. Frank watched as Maggie casually made her way toward the woman, stopping to exchange pleasantries with other attendees to avoid drawing attention. When she finally reached the third row, she took an empty seat beside the woman with the newspaper and leaned over to speak quietly. Through his earpiece, Frank could hear the exchange. Excuse me, Maggie said. Is anyone sitting here? The woman glanced up, startled. No, it's free. Thank you. A pause, then. I hear the John Deere 4440 hydraulics are particularly sensitive to temperature variations. The recognition phrase from David's protocol. Frank held his breath, waiting. The woman stiffened almost imperceptibly. Yes, but proper maintenance prevents most failures, she responded after a moment's hesitation, the correct countersign. I believe we have a mutual friend, Maggie continued softly. One who understood the importance of keeping good records. The woman's eyes darted around the room before returning to Maggie. "He's dead," she whispered. "And I'll be too if they realize I'm still accessing those files." "We can protect you," Maggie assured her. "But we need what you have." "Not here," the woman insisted. "It's too dangerous. Harrington's security is everywhere." "When and where?" The woman hesitated, then subtly passed a business card to Maggie. "Tonight, 10 o'clock. The address on the back, not the front." Before Maggie could respond, a commotion at the main entrance drew everyone's attention. Sheriff Blackburn was speaking urgently with one of the security personnel, who was showing her something on a tablet. The sheriff's expression darkened, and she began scanning the room with new intensity. "We've got a problem," Frank warned through the comm. "Security alert at the main door. Blackburn's involved." "They've made me," Maggie realized, rising casually from her seat. "My credentials must have triggered something." "Exit strategy. East corridor, where you are. Meet you there in 2 minutes." Frank watched as Maggie made her way toward the side exit, maintaining a calm demeanor that belied the urgency of the situation. She was halfway there when one of Harrington's security men intercepted her, blocking her path. "Ma'am, I need to see your invitation again," he said, loud enough for Frank to hear through the ventilation grate. "Of course," Maggie replied smoothly, reaching into her jacket. Instead of credentials, her hand emerged with a small canister that she discharged directly into the man's face. He recoiled with a shout, hands covering his eyes. Chaos erupted. Security personnel converged on Maggie's position as attendees scattered in confusion. On stage, Harrington was being hurried to a back exit by his protective detail. Frank didn't wait to see more. He burst from the supply closet and ran down the corridor toward Maggie's position, drawing the pistol he'd concealed beneath his maintenance uniform. He rounded a corner just as Maggie backed through the side exit. 2 security men in pursuit. "Down!" Frank shouted, and Maggie dropped instantly to a crouch. Frank fired 2 rounds over her head, not aiming to hit, but to force the pursuers back into cover. It worked. Both men ducked back into the exhibition hall, shouting for backup. "This way!" Frank grabbed Maggie's arm, pulling her toward the service exit. They sprinted down the corridor, the sounds of pursuit growing behind them. They burst through the maintenance door into the fading evening light, making directly for their vehicle. Frank slid behind the wheel while Maggie provided covering fire, forcing their pursuers to seek shelter rather than pursue immediately. The truck's engine roared to life, and Frank didn't waste time with subtle departures. He floored the accelerator, sending them hurtling across the fairground service area toward the perimeter fence. A chain-link gate blocked their path, but Frank didn't slow down. "Hold on," he warned, seconds before they crashed through the barrier in a screech of tearing metal. The truck shuddered but maintained momentum, carrying them onto the access road beyond. In the rearview mirror, Frank could see vehicles organizing in pursuit, black SUVs identical to those that had delivered Harrington to the event. "Did you get the meeting location?" he asked, taking a sharp turn onto a dirt road that cut through surrounding farmland. Maggie checked the business card she'd been given. "It's an address in Riverdale, 1420 Oakwood Drive." Frank frowned. "That's the Silver Dollar Saloon." "The bar, you're sure?" "Positive. Been there more times than I care to admit." Frank took another turn, this one onto an even smaller track that wound between fields of unharvested wheat. "It's also the place where those thugs who attacked me had matches from." Maggie's expression hardened. "It could be a trap. Or she's trying to meet somewhere public with witnesses," Frank countered. "Either way, it's our only lead to whatever information David's source has been collecting." The truck bounced violently as Frank guided it through a drainage ditch and up onto another access road. Their pursuers were nowhere in sight now. The maze of agricultural service roads gave a decisive advantage to anyone who'd spent their life navigating them. "We've lost them for now," Frank observed, easing off the accelerator slightly. "But they'll set up roadblocks on the main routes. We need to circle back toward Riverdale using the fire breaks and irrigation access roads." "And if it is a trap," Frank's grip tightened on the steering wheel, Then we spring it on our terms, not theirs. The Silver Dollar Saloon sat on the outskirts of Riverdale, a weathered building that had served generations of farmers, ranchers, and oilfield workers. Its neon sign flickered erratically in the night, casting pulses of red and blue light across the gravel parking lot where Frank and Maggie sat in their truck, surveying the scene. Two exits, Frank noted, main entrance and kitchen door in the back. Windows are too small for an adult to fit through. Typical crowd for a Thursday night, maybe 20 people inside? Any of Harrington's security? Maggie asked, scanning the vehicles in the lot. Not that I can identify, but that doesn't mean they're not watching the place. Frank checked his watch, 9:45 p.m. We're early. Let's do a circuit of the perimeter before going in. They drove slowly around the building, noting potential escape routes and vantage points where observers might be stationed. Nothing seemed immediately suspicious, but years in combat zones had taught Frank that the most dangerous ambushes were the ones you couldn't spot until it was too late. Your call, Maggie said as they completed their reconnaissance. In or out? Frank considered their options. The information David's source possessed could be the key to exposing Harrington's entire operation. Without it, they had theories and fragments, but nothing solid enough to overcome the man's political connections. In, he decided, but we play it cautious. I'll enter first. Take a position at the bar where I can watch the door. You follow 5 minutes later. Find a table with good sightlines. We identify the contact, verify she's alone, then approach. Maggie nodded, checking her concealed weapon. If it goes bad, kitchen exit, rendezvoused at the irrigation canal, a quarter-mile east. Frank removed David's blue cap, too recognizable now, and replaced it with a weathered Stetson from the truck's back seat. Ready. One thing first, Maggie said, reaching into her bag. She extracted a small device that looked like a compact digital recorder. Wireless signal jammer, 5-meter radius. It won't stop a coordinated assault, but it will prevent anyone from remotely activating devices or communicating once we're inside. Devices? Frank repeated, suddenly understanding. You think they'd bomb a public place? I think Harrington has billions riding on silencing anyone who threatens his project, Maggie replied grimly. And people who've killed once rarely develop moral qualms about doing it again. With that sobering thought, Frank exited the truck and walked casually toward the saloon's entrance. He pushed through the swinging doors into an atmosphere thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of spilled beer. Country music played from ancient speakers, barely audible over the hum of conversation and the crack of pool balls from tables in the back. Frank made his way to the bar, nodding to a few familiar faces while avoiding direct conversation. He ordered a whiskey, then positioned himself where he could observe both the entrance and the majority of the room. 5 minutes later, Maggie entered, without the business attire from the community meeting, dressed now in jeans and a flannel shirt. She looked like any other local woman stopping in for a drink after work. She found a table near the wall and ordered a beer from a passing waitress. The minutes ticked by, 9:55, 9:58, 10:00. Frank's gaze never stopped moving, cataloging each patron, noting newcomers, watching for any sign of their contact or potential threats. At 10:03, the door opened again, and the woman from the meeting entered. She'd changed clothes too. Gone was the professional blazer, replaced by casual wear that wouldn't draw attention in this setting. She scanned the room nervously, clutching her purse with white-knuckled intensity. Frank gave a subtle nod to Maggie, who acknowledged with an equally discreet gesture. The woman made her way to the bar, ordering a drink before taking a seat at a small table in the corner, an excellent defensive position with a clear view of both exits. Frank finished his whiskey, then casually moved to join her. Mind if I sit? He asked, keeping his voice low. The woman looked up, startled. Recognition flickered in her eyes. You're not David's partner, she said cautiously. His brother, Frank corrected. Frank Calloway. She studied him for a moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Susan Reeves, I was David's friend at the bank, Frank signaled Maggie, who joined them moments later, sliding the signal jammer onto the table and discreetly activating it. A tiny green light indicated it was functioning. We can speak freely now, Maggie said, at least about matters that don't require shouting over the music. Susan leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper despite the protection. I don't have much time. They're monitoring employee movements more closely since David's murder. So you know it was murder, Frank said. It wasn't a question. Of course I know, Susan replied, pain evident in her expression. David and I were close. He would never have taken his own life, especially not when we were so close to exposing everything. What exactly did you find? Maggie asked. Susan reached into her purse and extracted a flash drive, sliding it across the table. Everything. Loan manipulations going back 3 years. Interest rate adjustments made without customer notification. Property appraisals deliberately undervalued to trigger technical defaults. All of it orchestrated through code words and emails between Reed Walker and Victor Harrington. Frank pocketed the drive. And the mineral deposits, the rare earth elements. Susan's eyes widened slightly. You know about those too. David found geological surveys, Maggie explained. But we need more to connect Harrington directly to the knowledge of those deposits before the dam project was conceived. It's all there, Susan confirmed. Harrington commissioned private surveys disguised as environmental impact studies 2 years ago. The dam isn't about hydroelectric power. It's about creating a legitimate reason to excavate the valley floor. We need your testimony, Frank said. Documents can be disputed, discredited, but a senior bank employee with first-hand knowledge of the conspiracy. Susan shook her head emphatically. I can't. They killed David. They burned down your shop. I have children. Mr. Calloway, we can protect you, Maggie insisted. Federal witness protection? Like you protected David, Susan countered bitterly. He trusted your agency too, and look what happened. Before Maggie could respond, Frank noticed a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The conversations at nearby tables had gone quiet, and several patrons were moving toward the exits with suspicious casualness. We need to leave, he said quietly. Now. Susan glanced around, panic rising in her eyes. What is it? We've been made, Maggie confirmed, already rising from her chair. Susan, come with us. Whatever protection you think you have, as long as you stay quiet, it's an illusion. Harrington can't afford to leave any loose ends. The woman hesitated, torn between terror of Harrington and the realization that her safety was already compromised. Finally, she nodded, gathering her purse with trembling hands. Kitchen exit, Frank directed, leading the way through the crowded bar. They had nearly reached the back when the main doors burst open, and 4 men in tactical gear rushed in, weapons drawn. Shouts and screams erupted as patrons dove for cover. Calloway, one of the intruders shouted. Federal agents on the ground. Now, federal my ass, Frank muttered, recognizing one of the men from the attack on his shop. He drew his pistol, firing 2 rounds into the ceiling. Everybody down. The diversion worked patrons and staff hit the floor, creating chaos that momentarily confused the attackers. Frank used the opportunity to hustle Maggie and Susan through the kitchen and out the rear exit. They emerged into the back alley where dumpsters provided temporary cover. The truck's on the other side of the building, Frank said. We'll never reach it now. There! Maggie pointed to a pickup parked behind the kitchen door, presumably belonging to one of the staff. Keys might be inside. They sprinted for the vehicle, Susan struggling to keep pace in her panic. The pickup's door was unlocked, but a quick search revealed no keys. I can hotwire it, Frank said, dropping to his knees beside the steering column. Cover the alley. Maggie took position with her weapon drawn, scanning for pursuers. Susan huddled against the truck, her earlier professional composure completely abandoned. They'll kill me, she repeated, like they killed David, like they tried to kill you. Not if I have anything to say about it, Frank grunted, working to expose the necessary wires beneath the dashboard. The rear door of the saloon crashed open, and two of the attackers emerged, weapons raised. Maggie fired immediately, forcing them back into cover behind the dumpsters. "Frank," she called urgently. "Almost there," he replied, twisting wires together with practiced fingers. The pickup's engine sputtered, then roared to life. "Get in!" Maggie backed toward the vehicle, maintaining fire to keep their pursuers pinned down. Just as she reached the passenger door, Susan suddenly bolted, running toward the open field behind the bar. "Susan, no!" Frank shouted. Too late. The woman had barely made it 10 yards when a shot rang out from somewhere in the darkness. Susan stumbled, then collapsed face down in the gravel. "Sniper," Maggie realized, diving into the truck. They had the exits covered. "Go." "Frank, go." Frank slammed the pickup into reverse, backing rapidly away from the building as more shots peppered the vehicle's body. He executed a sharp turn, then shifted to drive and floored the accelerator, sending them hurtling down the alley toward the road beyond. In the side mirror, he caught a final glimpse of Susan Reeves lying motionless in the bar's backyard, another victim of Victor Harrington's ruthless pursuit of wealth and power, another death that demanded justice. "The flash drive," Maggie said urgently. "Do you still have it?" Frank patted his pocket, confirming its presence. "Got it, but without Susan's testimony—" "The documents will have to be enough," Maggie insisted. "We'll find a way to make them count." They sped through the darkened countryside, taking back roads and farm tracks to evade potential pursuit. Neither spoke for several minutes, the shock of Susan's murder hanging heavily between them. Finally, Frank broke the silence. "She was more than David's source at the bank," he said quietly. "You heard how she spoke about him?" Maggie nodded. "They were involved romantically. It explains her access to his research, her willingness to take risks. And why she was targeted after his death," Frank added grimly. "Harrington leaves no loose ends. Except us," Maggie pointed out. Frank's grip tightened on the steering wheel, not for lack of trying. He took a turn onto an even smaller road, barely more than a tractor path between fields. "We need to get somewhere safe. Review what's on that drive." "Not the Jensen place," Maggie decided. "If they identified me at the community meeting, they might connect me to that property." Frank considered their options. Most of his usual haunts would be under surveillance now, especially after the confrontation at the Silver Dollar. They needed somewhere off the grid, somewhere only he would know about. "I have a place," he said finally. "My father's hunting cabin. It's not on any property records. He traded repair work for it back in the 70s, and the transfer was never officially recorded. No electricity, no running water, but it's isolated and defensible." "How far?" "About 30 miles from here, in the foothills. Rough terrain, only accessible by four-wheel drive or on foot, but it has a wood stove, basic supplies, and no one's used it in years except me." Maggie nodded. "Lead on." As they drove deeper into the Montana night, Frank found himself thinking about Susan Reeves, a woman he'd never met before tonight, yet who had clearly meant something significant to his brother. Another life cut short by Harrington's ambition. Another reason why, whatever it took, the man had to be stopped. The flash drive in Frank's pocket felt heavier than its negligible physical weight. On it lay the culmination of David's investigation, the evidence he died trying to bring to light, whatever it contained. Frank swore silently. It would not have been in vain. Behind them, the lights of Riverdale faded into the darkness. Ahead lay only the night-shrouded landscape of Harvest County, the land they were fighting to save, the community worth any risk to protect. Frank drove on, his resolve hardening with each mile. Victor Harrington had taken everything from him, his brother, his livelihood, and now any chance of a peaceful resolution to this conflict. All that remained was justice, whatever form it might take, and Frank Calloway intended to deliver it, one way or another. Montana winters come harsh and unforgiving, but they always yield to spring, As the snow melts from Eagle's Gorge, revealing Earth untouched by the dam that never came, the people of Harvest County gather not to mourn what was lost, but to rebuild what remains. Frank Calloway's hands still bear the scars of that long fight, the burns from his shop, the knife wound from men who thought they could silence the truth. Some mornings his joints ache with the ghost of old injuries, but on the workbench before him, a new generation learns what his father taught him. What his brother died protecting, that understanding how things work is the first step in fixing what's broken. Not all victories come without cost. Not all wounds heal completely. The corporate names on the buildings may have changed, but the struggle between those who work the land and those who seek to own it continues in quieter ways. Yet something fundamental has shifted in this valley. When farmers gather at the new community repair center, when young hands learn to breathe life back into machines others deemed worthless, they're preserving more than equipment. They're maintaining a covenant with those who came before and those who will come after. Perhaps that's the truest form of craftsmanship, knowing that what we fix today carries forward a legacy no flood could ever wash away.